Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to week 9. Our lecture topic today is illustration. I'm Erin and I'm filling in for Ace today. Okay, so quickly what we're going to go over in lecture today is we're going to introduce the final, go over illustration basics, go over the pen tool again, go over fill and effects, and then wrap up. Okay, so this is the attendance link. And this is the slide deck. Okay, so now I'm going to be explaining what the final is. So basically the final project for this class is you create your own final project proposal. So basically the goal of this class is to make sure you can execute your own projects through Figma. So the final project is a way of showing that you can create something using Figma and using the skills you learned in this class. And some requirements for the project are that you need to show that you incorporated at least 2 of these skills, auto layout, variants, prototyping, and illustration. So some examples of final projects could be making a full illustration, making a website, making an app prototype, a video game, or like a personal journal. As long as you incorporate like 2 of these skills, you can pretty much do anything for the final. Yeah. And just some logistics is that the proposal is due Monday and it must include the project idea and description, the 2 skills, and then a midpoint check-in goal. And then the midpoint check-in will be due Monday, April 17. And this is just like a way to make sure that, you know, you're on track, you're getting everything done. Yeah. Okay, and your final submission for this project is just going to be a Figma file and form. So it'll be similar to the midterm, in which you'll have a PDF that shows your write-up and then a link to your Figma file. And you also have the opportunity to present it in lecture. Oh, and another thing is that you need to document your entire process, not just the final product. Yeah. And just an important deadline, the final will be due Sunday, April 23rd. And yeah, for questions, you can reach out to Ace or any of the course staff. And for example, final projects, there are some that are going to be made available on the Slack and also are available on the course website, I believe. Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the topic of the lecture, which is illustration. So it's time to cancel your Adobe subscription. Basically because Figma has like a lot of vector illustration capabilities. So here are some examples of vector illustrations created by Spencer Camp. So these were all illustrations created in Figma. And then as well as these game consoles, you can see you can create like more abstract stuff, but you can do like really cute vector patterns as well. And these are some antique calculators. I think these are interesting because you can basically like create something that's like more realistic using Figma too. You can see they use like shadows and layering. Another example illustration. This is a good example of something you could potentially do for your final project. Yeah, just by using gradients and multiple layers with different opacities, you can start to create like more realistic vector illustrations. And again, this is like a realistic briefcase. So yeah, you can do like realistic illustrations just using vectors. You can see they probably used like multiple shadows here and then a highlight gradient here, as well as just like a lot of different shapes. And yeah, also a vector illustration. And the cool thing about all of these, if you open the file that's linked in the slides, you can actually see like each of the individual vectors they use to create this piece. Let's see if it opens up. Yeah, I don't have it downloaded. I'll download it later, but Yeah, you can see that even though this looks blurry, it's like a clear vector illustration. And then Monument Valley, someone built like a design kit for Monument Valley in Figma. So they basically just designed all these like isometric pieces, and you can build your own Monument Valley using these vector illustrations. Yeah, another example of a realistic illustration. Okay, now we're just going to go over some basics of like what is illustration and what you need to know and how you can use this in this class. So basically, illustration is visual imagery that can express or communicate. So that's pretty broad. And so we pointed out some examples here. So that can range from everything from anatomical illustrations to, sorry, the screen went off, to Where's Waldo, to paintings like classical European paintings and just any sort of art in like any form, and then book cover illustrations. Yeah, so ranges in detail and also ranges in function. Okay, and more specifically, vector illustration. So as a refresher, vectors are lines, points, and curves that maintain their structure. So versus like if you have a PNG, that's an image made with pixels. So if you copy paste that in different formats, the quality is going to change because it's not made with like a mathematical computation of lines. It's made with this just like pixels drawn on the screen. But vectors are going to maintain their quality, which is why they're really good for web design. Yeah, because a vector is a digital illustration. Yeah, so these are all examples of vector illustrations. And see, even though vector illustrations are made with like points and lines, they don't necessarily have to be like blocky or using just one color. It can be, you can do like a lot of shadows just by using gradients and blurs and still have it be a vector illustration. Yeah, which I think is like a common misconception. Okay. And so now if for anyone who's like taken an art class or has designed anything before, we're going to just briefly going to go over some principles like perspective, color, and composition. And these you can use when if you plan on creating an illustration for anything in your final projects. Yeah, so perspective is how you understand three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional space. So there are a variety of ways you can achieve perspective. So the first example is one-point perspective. And you can just do this by drawing a dot on your screen and then drawing lines extending out of that, and then drawing your shapes in between the lines. It's kind of difficult to understand, but basically like most things you'll draw are in one-point perspective, or a lot of things you can like pinpoint the vanishing point. Yeah, so you can see the horizon line and the lines drawn out of it. And yeah, two-point perspective is where you add like an additional vanishing point. Okay, and then here are some examples of perspective. So for example, in the bottom right, you can see the vanishing point is probably like somewhere in the back where these buildings are, because like the lines extend out. I don't know, if you're making an illustration of like your hometown or like downtown Berkeley, you might want to consider having perspective lines drawn into your illustration. Yeah. Okay, isometric. I don't know if people have heard of isometric, but it's a little bit of a trend in designing. It's basically a way of designing everything that like conveys a sense of three-dimensionality, but doesn't actually have like realistic vanishing points. Basically, the core of isometric design is that there are two parallel lines that create a lot of diamonds, and by like filling in these diamonds, you can create like an illustration. So Monument Valley is an example of isometric design. And if you're interested in doing this for your final project, you can just look it up on the internet, but basically you need to create like a specific grid and then just start like filling in that grid. It just has to do with like the proportions of the lines. Yeah, so again, some examples of isometric design. It might be useful in game design where, like, for example, this Ferris wheel like game, you can just like start building everything in one plane, rather than having to deal with like perspective in 3D. Yeah. Okay. And then atmospheric perspective is the idea of using like the distance, using color and reduced clarity to represent like distance from the audience. So here you can see that like the blue rectangle closest to you is lighter and the one farther away from you is less clear and it's darker. You can do that just by blurring the background layers and adjusting the colors. Yeah, something you might want to consider. Okay, some uses of atmospheric perspective. I think mainly for these, like for example, in the Mona Lisa, the background is blurred. That's an example of like something being more clear in the foreground. Okay, and then this is just like 2D flat art. Yeah, so flat is often like in the style of UI UX design. It's just shapes and colors that are meant to like represent what something is, even if it's like not realistic. So this might be like an icon of an apple or something like that. Yeah, so this is just the point of this is that not all art needs to be like realistic or have depth or adhere to these principles. Yeah, so again, these are not exhaustive principles and you can experiment what you need to convey. Yeah, you can pretty much create anything you want with vector illustration, and we'll go into some more examples later. Okay. Now we're gonna go over color. Yeah, I think we went over color a little bit earlier this semester on like what different colors convey for like design principles, but we're gonna go into it again. So for example, color and design can basically like draw our attention. It basically determines like how we interact with a product or an interface. So a useful tool is the color wheel. You've probably seen this before, but primary colors is red, yellow, and blue. And then in between that, you get orange, green, and purple. And then tertiary colors. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is like more relevant to design because you can see these are just some common associations with these different colors. So if you were designing like a credit card, like a credit exchange app, you might want to use blue because it has to do with like trust and loyalty and competence. Yeah, if you had that interface be like bright red, that might be like a little sketchy because I don't know, red is very energetic and like often means like warning. So that probably wouldn't be the best for like a currency exchange. But yeah, it was probably like ideal for a stop sign. So just keep these like color connotations in mind. Okay, and now quickly again, going over hue, saturation, and value. So yeah, hue is basically where the color is on the color wheel. Saturation is the intensity and value is how light or dark the color is. So I think you can see that better when you look at the fill of a shape in Figma. So yeah, you can see that the hue is determined by this bar and then the saturation and value are like both over here. Yeah. Okay. Another recap of hue using the tool that I just showed you. Okay. So yeah, expressing color in Figma. So basically in Figma, everything is going to be in RGB. So like when you look at an image on a digital screen, the computer like makes the colors using RGB quantities. So mainly, yeah, for web, you'll see your colors in RGB. So those are more like vibrant, bold colors. But if you're printing something out, not in Figma, I guess this is only useful if you're printing like a flyer or a poster, you'll want to switch to CMYK because physical ink colors like don't have the same colors as web colors. Which is something I didn't know before taking this class. So yeah, all your colors in Figma are represented by the amount of like red, green, or blue light they have in them. Okay. And Now creating color palettes. Okay, also these color palettes were probably created in Coolors with like I think 2 or 3 O's. It's just like a color palette creating app that you can use for, like, say you're designing a website and you need like a color scheme with 3 colors for like the main like heading and text. You can just auto generate these color palettes, which is really useful. But now we want to go into like what colors look good. So something to consider is mixing like warm and cool colors. Yeah, this variety in colors, like, I guess, will stimulate your brain. And yeah, people like to see this contrast. Okay, these are examples of warm and cool colors, even though they're all like pretty close to black or gray. This could be considered like a cool black, and then this is like a warm, like blackish brown, because this one's more red and this one's more blue. But yeah. Okay, and then going into color schemes. So another way of creating color palettes is you could follow a specific color scheme using the color wheel. So complementary is just across from each other on the wheel, and I think the graphic illustrates the rest of it. Yeah, but oftentimes these colors, like, even though they like are next to each other or they follow this on the color pattern, that doesn't necessarily mean that your brain thinks they're colors that go well together. So you still need to consider like value and contrast, like pairing a light color with a dark color, all that stuff. Okay, and some examples of using the color scheme. Okay. So another technique for creating color palettes is keeping one property consistent. So like for example, with this one, on the top left with all these bright colors, these all have a similar, I'd say at least the first 4 have a similar value, even though they're all different hues. Same with this matte colored one. You can imagine, I feel like this would be for more like a skincare brand or like some sort of health and wellness brands, just because of all these like earthy tones. Yeah. Okay, and color context. Yeah, it's important to look at your colors in context because these 2 purple rectangles in the middle are both the exact same color, but the one, oh my gosh, it's really hard to see on the screen. But like the one on the left in the blue background, like it blends in a lot more. So just keep in mind having like enough contrast between your background and the color in the foreground so that if someone who's colorblind or can't really tell the difference between colors can tell like what your design is. Yeah. Okay, light and context. So one last note is you need to know how light affects color. Yeah, so basically by adding like different lights to these colors, it like changes their properties. Okay, next we're going to go over composition. So, let's see what time it is. Okay, so composition is just how you lay out all these elements. And I think when you're designing anything from like, I don't know, an interface to a diagram, you need to consider like which elements stand out and how they look in the context of the whole piece. So one rule for composition that you could either strategically break or adhere to is the rule of thirds. So this is basically the property that your eye is naturally drawn to the intersection of the thirds in this grid. So you can see each of these phone screens is divided into thirds. Yeah, so you might want to place like critical objects at these 2/3 points to like help divide the piece. Okay. And then here's an example of this famous melting clock piece divided with the rule of thirds. You can see that this table like aligns almost neatly with this line here. Yeah. Another composition with rule of thirds. The crack is kind of pretty close to this third right here. Yeah. So visual triangles is another way of creating compositions. So basically this is like situating all the elements, like looking in a triangle shape. Yeah, we can see the Mona Lisa is a little bit of a triangle shape, and this painting of the dogs has them like peeking up in the triangle. Oh, and this is from Parasite. The scenes in Parasite are like composed really, really well in that they like want to make sure everything's balanced. Or in like particular scenes, they want to make sure everything's balanced. So this is like from the beginning of the movie when everything's pretty happy. So they have like the peach and her head and then the elbow off screen, like forming a triangle. Yeah, it like shows like a pretty nice balance on the screen. And then the Harry Potter covers have these triangles. Yeah, I feel like this Chamber of Secrets one is like using negative space really well because the Chamber of Secrets is like in the middle of the triangle. So the triangle like kind of frames it to make sure your eye is like looking at the title. Okay, and now movement. This is a way of like representing motion without the piece actually moving. So this like blurry spiraling shapes give the illusion of movement. And again, the Great Wave definitely shows movement because you can imagine like the wave coming up. Then movement of people walking towards and away from the vanishing point. Dance and negative space. Okay, I think negative space is really important in design, especially in UI UX design or designs where you use mainly like one or two colors, because the negative space often refers to where there is lack of elements, and you want to like use that lack of elements to highlight what's important. Yeah, so here's an example. Negative space like around the figure. Oh, and this is a really important example of negative space because it's almost like the buildings are cutting into the sky and then the figure is like ascending like up, even though he's moving down into the city. By having this like a lot of negative space around Miles, you can see that it really accents him. So you can keep that in mind. Like, I don't know, if you're designing an interface and you want a button to be like something really important that you want people to click, like you might want to have a lot of negative space highlighting that button. Yeah. Okay, questions. Yeah, I think this lecture will be a little bit faster today, and it'll be recorded in 2 parts. Okay. The next part is going to be like more technical illustration, like basically how to create illustrations using the pen tool. So I'm going to stop the recording and make it a part 2.